There was a moment, standing in the middle of that enormous garage with marble floors and lighting rigs that cost more than my truck, when I realized that every single person in that room was looking at the wrong thing. They were looking at the clock, they were looking at the car, they were looking at each other. And I was looking at a woman who had just lost her father, and I was the only one in that room who understood exactly what she needed, and it had nothing to do with horsepower. My name is Danny Kowalski. I am 41 years old. I work out of a two-bay shop in Medford, Oregon, that I have been renting for 9 years. I drive a 2009 Ford F-150 with a cracked dashboard and a passenger seat that my daughter Becca has claimed as her personal home workstation every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon when school lets out early. I am not anybody. I want to be clear about that before I tell you any of this. I grew up in a house where my dad fixed everything himself because we couldn't afford not to. Washing machines, lawn mowers, the furnace twice, our neighbor's outboard motor in exchange for a side of venison that fed us for most of one winter. When I was 8 years old, he handed me a flathead screwdriver and told me that every broken thing has a reason it broke. And if you slow down and listen to it, it'll tell you. I didn't understand what he meant for about 20 years. Now I understand it so well. I've tried to explain it to Becca, and she looks at me the exact same way I used to look at him. Like I'm just making things up to sound smart. I am not a fancy mechanic. I don't work on Lamborghinis or rare imports as a rule. My bread and butter is domestic, pickups, minivans, the occasional aging sedan somebody's grandmother drove until she couldn't anymore. My shop smells like oil and old coffee and the pine tree air freshener I buy in bulk from the auto parts store 4 at a time. It is not a glamorous operation, but it is mine, and I know what I'm doing in it. And most of the people I work for have been coming to me for years because they trust me, and I trust them back, and that is about as good as it gets in this line of work. The reason I ended up in that garage on a Thursday afternoon in November has a name, and that name is Arthur Whitfield. Arthur Whitfield was 67 years old when I met him. He came into my shop on a rainy March afternoon about 6 years ago driving a 1969 Pontiac GTO that he had owned since he was 22. And he was worried about a knock in the engine that nobody else had been able to find. I asked him to leave it with me for a couple days. When I called him on day 2 and told him what I'd found, a hairline crack in a valve seat that was so subtle most diagnostic equipment wouldn't have flagged it, he got quiet on the phone for a moment, and then he said, "You actually found it." And I said, "Yeah, I actually found it." He came in the next morning and sat in my shop while I explained what needed to happen. Not because he didn't trust me, because he loved that car the way some people love other people, and he wanted to be there for the conversation. I respected that completely. I would have done the same thing. Arthur came back after the repair, and then he came back the following spring for a tune-up, and then he started calling me just to talk. About the GTO at first, about how he'd bought it with 2 years of savings and driven it to California and back the summer of 1976, and slept in it outside of Flagstaff one night because he couldn't afford the motel. About the time it broke down in a rainstorm outside Boise and a family in a station wagon stopped, and the father of that family had spent 2 hours in the rain with him trying to figure it out, and refused to take a dime when they finally got it started. He said he never forgot that man, never found out his name, never got to say thank you the right way. Then eventually Arthur started calling about other things, about his wife Margaret who had passed 4 years earlier, about his daughter Stephanie who lived in San Francisco and ran some kind of company he was proud of, but didn't entirely understand. About Becca, when I told him I was raising her alone after her mother left when Becca was 3. He had a lot of feelings about that, strong ones. He told me once that a man who shows up every day for a child who needs him is doing the most important work there is, period, and that the world would be better off if more people understood that. I wrote that down when we hung up. I still have it somewhere. Arthur Whitfield was worth, depending on which year you asked, somewhere between $400 million and $1.2 billion. He had built a logistics company from a single leased warehouse in 1989 and sold it 30 years later. He lived alone in a house outside Ashland, Oregon, in a neighborhood where the driveways were longer than my street, and he drove his 1969 Pontiac GTO to my shop himself, because he said it was the only car he trusted and the only shop he did too. He did not tell me about the money for almost a year, and when he did, it was almost like he was apologizing for it. He said money had a way of making people see the wrong thing. He'd spent enough of his life watching people look at his net worth instead of his face, and he was tired of it. I told him I understood. I didn't know yet how exactly right he was. Arthur died in August. A stroke. Fast, his doctor said, which I have tried to decide whether that is a comfort. Becca cried when I told her, which surprised me because she'd only met him twice. Once when he'd stopped in while she was doing homework in my passenger seat, and once at a 4th of July thing he'd thrown at his house and somehow convinced me to bring her too. But she cried and I held it together until I was alone, and then I didn't. His daughter Stephanie Whitfield called me about 3 weeks after the funeral. I had met Stephanie once at that same 4th of July. She was polished and careful in the way that people are when they've spent years being polished, and careful in rooms where it mattered. She ran a tech company in San Francisco with a name I couldn't keep straight. She was not unkind. She just had the look of someone for whom warmth was something she applied deliberately, rather than something that happened naturally. That is not a criticism. That is just an observation from a man who meets a lot of different kinds of people across a shop counter and has learned to read them quickly. She said, "Danny, my father left me a letter, and in the letter he mentioned you." I didn't say anything. She said, "He also left me the GTO." I said I knew about the GTO. She said she wanted to start it. That was the phrase she used. She wanted to start it. Not drive it, not restore it, not sell it. Start it. She said her father had driven it the week before he died, and she wanted to hear it run. She said she'd tried and it wouldn't turn over, and she'd had 3 different mechanics look at it and they all said different things, and She stopped for a second. She said, "I just want to hear it just one more time. I know that sounds irrational." I said it didn't sound irrational at all. She told me the full story then. She'd assembled what she called a proper team, 4 certified mechanics from a specialty shop in Portland that handled imports and classics, 2 engineers she'd brought in from a restoration house in Los Angeles, and a consultant from a Pontiac Collectors Association who'd flown in specifically. She was paying for all of it. She had allocated, she said, up to $100,000 to resolve the problem. And none of them had been able to start it. She asked if I would come look at it, not because she expected me to do what the others couldn't. She said she knew that was a long shot. She said she just thought that I had known her father, and maybe that mattered. I told her I'd come Saturday. I want to tell you what I was thinking on the drive down. I was thinking about Arthur. I was thinking about the things he'd told me over 6 years of phone calls and shop visits, which at this point probably added up to more hours than I'd spent talking to anyone who wasn't my daughter. I was thinking about the GTO specifically, not as a mechanical object, but the way Arthur talked about it. He didn't talk about it like a car. He talked about it like a relationship. He said once that it had moods. He said you had to know it. He said every single time he turned the key, it was like a conversation, and he had to bring the right thing to that conversation or nothing was going to happen. I had thought that was just the way old men talk about old cars. I was starting to think it might have been more than that. The garage at the Ashland house was 3 bays wide and climate-controlled and had better lighting than most operating rooms. The GTO sat in the center bay under a work lamp, and around it, at various postures of frustration, stood the assembled team. 2 men in matching coveralls with a shop logo I didn't recognize, a younger man in a fleece vest with a laptop open on a rolling cart, and an older gentleman in chinos and a button-down who I gathered was the Pontiac consultant. Stephanie stood off to the side, arms crossed, dressed like she had somewhere else to be, even though she'd been standing in a garage for 3 days. They looked at me when I walked in. I'm a regular-sized man in a flannel shirt and work pants with grease that doesn't entirely wash out anymore. I'm not an imposing figure. One of the men in coveralls actually looked behind me, like maybe the real help was coming in a second, and I was just holding the door. Stephanie introduced me as a mechanic her father had trusted. The Pontiac consultant, his name was something Elroy or Delroy, something like that, asked where I was certified. I told him I was ASE certified and had been working on American domestics for 19 years. He nodded in a way that was designed to be polite but was actually dismissive, and I didn't take it personally because I have seen that nod 100 times and it has never once turned out to mean what the person giving it thought it meant. They walked me through everything they'd done. New battery. Fuel system flush. They'd pulled the carburetor twice, rebuilt it once. They'd checked the ignition, the timing, the points. The younger man with the laptop had run diagnostics that I am not even sure applied to a 1969 engine, but I kept that thought to myself. The Pontiac man had spoken at length about a specific grounding issue common to GTOs of this vintage, and they'd addressed it. By every measurement they had, the car should start. It would not start. I crouched down next to the driver's side and just looked at it for a while. Not at the engine. I wasn't ready for the engine yet. I looked at the interior. The seat, worn perfectly in the driver's position after 50-some years of Arthur. The dash, with a small crack on the right side that he'd told me, happened in 1984 and he'd never fixed it because he said it was part of the car's face now. The steering wheel, where the leather was smooth in 2 patches, exactly where his hands would have rested. I opened the driver's door and sat down. The Pontiac consultant said, "We've been over the ignition switch thoroughly." I said I knew. I just sat there for a minute, in Arthur's seat, looking at Arthur's dash, feeling the weight of what a car like this carries after a life like his. And then I noticed something. On the floor of the passenger side, partially under the seat, was a small square of garage mat, the rubber kind, black with a grid pattern. It was not one of the mats that came with the car. It was cut from a larger sheet, maybe 8 by 8 inches, and it was placed very deliberately at an angle, and beneath it, just barely visible at the corner, was the edge of something. I reached across and lifted the mat. There was a piece of folded index card underneath. Written in Arthur's handwriting, I recognized it from notes he'd left me twice over the years. It said, in his neat block printing, "Left foot down, neutral, 3 pumps, wait for the click from the dash, then turn. She needs to know it's you." I sat with that for a second. Left foot down. That was a choke technique from a driver who'd learned the car's specific fuel mixture behavior over decades. 3 pumps of the gas pedal. Wait for the click, which I suspected was a specific sound from the fuel system pressurizing in a way only Arthur had ever paid attention to. Then turn. She needs to know it's you. Arthur had been starting this car the same way for 50 years. Not the right way, not the textbook way. His way. A ritual he'd developed through 10,000 mornings of listening to the engine until he understood its language. He hadn't written it down because he'd never imagined a world where he wouldn't be the one starting it. He hadn't told anyone because it wasn't something he'd thought of as information. It was just what you did. It was just how you talked to the car. I stepped out and walked to the front and asked them to pop the hood. I looked at the carburetor, at the fuel line, at the choke assembly. Everything they'd done was correct. There was nothing wrong with this car in any mechanical sense that any of them had been wrong about. The car was in good working order. It simply had never been started by anyone who knew it. I looked at Stephanie across the engine compartment. She was watching me with the kind of controlled patience that I recognized as the surface expression of something much more raw underneath. She had been standing in this garage for 3 days watching experts fail, and she had not fallen apart, and the not falling apart was costing her something. I said, "Stephanie, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think about it carefully." She said, "Okay." I said, "When they collected your father's things after he passed, his clothes, his wallet, whatever was in his pockets, was there a key ring?" "Not a fancy one. He wasn't a fancy key ring kind of man. Probably just a plain split ring or something cheap he'd had forever." She went very still. She said, "There was a key ring. Just a ring, nothing on it. I thought it was a spare ring for something." I said, "Did you happen to bring it?" She said she had everything. She hadn't been able to throw any of it away. She went inside and came back with a small manila envelope of the kind hospitals use for personal effects, and inside, among other things, was a plain steel split ring with 2 keys on it. No fob, no tag, nothing decorative. Just a ring and 2 keys worn smooth where a hand had held them. One key was a house key. The other was the GTO key. She handed it to me. I went back to the driver's door and sat down in Arthur's seat. I held the key ring in my left hand for a second. Then I put my left foot flat on the floor. I pressed the gas pedal 3 times, slow and deliberate. I waited, and from somewhere in the fuel system came a small, quiet, particular click that I genuinely don't think any of the people in that room had ever heard before, because they had never been listening for it. I turned the key. The engine turned over twice, caught, and then, with a low, rolling, barrel-chested growl that bounced off the marble floors and the climate-controlled walls and probably went out under the garage door and across the driveway into the cold November air. The 1969 Pontiac GTO came to life. Nobody said anything. Stephanie Whitfield sat down on the floor of her father's garage, not because her legs gave out, deliberately. She just folded down cross-legged right there on the concrete and put her hands in her lap and closed her eyes and listened. I got out and walked to the front of the car and stood there. The engine ran beautifully. It ran the way something runs when it has been loved and maintained and understood by one person for 50 years. It was the most honest sound I have heard in a long time. We let it run for about 4 minutes. Then Stephanie opened her eyes. She was not crying, or she was done crying, or she was holding it somewhere I couldn't see. She stood up and she looked at me and she said, "Danny, name your price." I said I wanted to make sure she understood what I'd actually done, which was read a note her father left and follow his instructions. She said she didn't care. She said she wanted to pay me for coming, for knowing to look, for understanding her father well enough to know where to look. She said she wanted to write me a check right now. She said she had authorized up to $100,000 for this. I said I didn't want $100,000. She looked at me the way people look at you when they think you're negotiating. I told her I wasn't negotiating. I told her I'd take my standard shop rate for the hours I'd put in, which at that point was about 2 hours including the drive. $90 an hour was what I charged, so call it $200 rounded up. Cash was fine. I didn't even need to write it up if she didn't want a receipt. She said, "That's insane. You did what no one else could do. You found." I said, "Stephanie, your dad left that note for you." She stopped. I said, "He drove that car the week before he died. He drove it knowing it might be one of the last times, and he left those instructions under that mat because some part of him knew that someday you were going to want to start it, and he wanted to be there for that. He just left you directions." I watched her face do something complicated. I told her that the note was hers, the keyring was hers, the car was hers, and every Sunday morning she wanted to hear it run. She now had everything she needed to hear it run, and she didn't need me or any other mechanic to do it for her. She asked if she could keep my number. I said of course. She paid me $210, and she wrote it from a checkbook she pulled from her coat pocket, and the handwriting on the check was identical to her father's in a way that I'm sure she didn't know. I put the check in my breast pocket and shook her hand and said I was sorry about Arthur, truly, because I was. When I got back to my truck, I sat in the parking area for a minute before I started it up. It was late afternoon and the light was going low and orange the way it does in the valley in November, and the air through my cracked window smelled like fallen leaves and someone's wood stove somewhere. I thought about Arthur, about 50 years of starting the same car the same way, about how a habit that deep becomes its own kind of language, and when you lose someone you also lose every word of that language because they were the only one who ever spoke it. About how the worst part of grief isn't the big empty spaces but the small specific sounds that go quiet, the particular way someone clears their throat before they start a sentence, the weight of a hand on a car door before they get in, the click of a fuel system that only one person in the world ever listened for. Becca asked me that night at dinner where I'd been, and I told her I'd been helping a woman start her father's car. She said, "Did you fix it?" I thought about that for a second. I said, "I didn't fix anything. It wasn't broken. It just needed someone who paid attention." She considered this with the serious face she makes when she's deciding whether I'm saying something worth filing away. Then she said, "Dad, that's the same thing." And she went back to her pasta. I don't know if she's right. I think maybe she is. I think maybe paying attention, real attention, the kind that costs you something, the kind that requires you to slow all the way down and listen until you understand, is the most useful thing any of us can do for the people we love. And I think sometimes we confuse it with something smaller, something simpler, and we go looking for the complicated answer when the whole time there was a folded index card waiting under a piece of rubber mat telling us exactly what we needed to know. I saw the check. I framed it. Not because of the amount, because Arthur's daughter wrote it in Arthur's hand, and that means he paid me himself one last time, and I am not ready to cash that yet. What is the small thing, the particular sound, the specific smell, the ordinary word in the ordinary voice, that you would give just about anything to have back from someone you've lost? I think about that more than I probably should. I think most of us do. if we're honest. I just hope somebody out there is writing it down. I've been turning that afternoon over in my head ever since. The way you turn a coin over when you find it in an old coat pocket and aren't sure if it's worth anything or everything. What I keep coming back to is this. None of what happened in that garage was luck. Arthur Whitfield spent 50 years paying attention to something most people would have looked right past. He listened to an engine the way you listen to a person you love. Not for information, not for data, but because the listening itself was the point. And because he did that. Because he had the patience and the care to do that for 5 decades. He left his daughter something no amount of money could have bought her, a way back in. That's what I think about when people talk about integrity, not the big dramatic moments. The daily, invisible, unglamorous practice of caring about the thing in front of you. Really caring, not performing it. Arthur cared about that car because it was connected to every version of himself he'd ever been, and that care outlasted him. It was sitting there under a rubber mat, waiting for someone to notice. The harder thing, and I mean the thing that actually costs you something, is doing it when nobody's watching and nobody's going to reward you for it. I went into that garage with no expectation of anything. I went because a grieving woman asked me to come, and I had known her father, and that was reason enough. I didn't go in thinking I'd find what I found. I went in thinking I might at least be able to sit with her in her confusion for a while, and that would have been enough. That willingness to show up without a guaranteed outcome, I think that's a kind of intelligence that doesn't get talked about enough. It's not book knowledge. It's not credentials. It's the understanding that most of what matters in life reveals itself only to people who are present and patient, and not in a hurry to be somewhere else. And then there's the part where you keep going when it's hard. Raising Becca alone. Running a 2-bay shop when I could have quit twice and nobody would have blamed me. Driving 2 hours to look at a car I wasn't sure I could help with. Knowing that a room full of more credentialed people had already failed. None of that is dramatic. It doesn't look like anything from the outside. But you have to keep showing up. You have to keep putting your left foot down and pumping the gas 3 times and waiting for the click even when you're not sure the click is coming. You do it because you trust the process. Because you trust that attention and effort and honesty compound over time the same way interest does. Becca said something that night that I've thought about almost every day since. She said, "That's the same thing." She meant that what I did for Stephanie's car is what I try to do for her. Pay attention, stay present, not pretend to know more than I do, and trust that showing up is most of the answer. I don't know if she's right. I think maybe she is. I think the people who find the folded note under the mat are almost always the people who deserved to find it.